picking up now on our third part of Part 1 of American History 1. We talked about the different zones of American colonization. You have New England, the southern colonies, middle colonies. As a case study for the southern colonies, we usually like to look at Virginia's economy during the colonial period. And the number one standout feature basically of all the southern colonies, and Virginia in particular, was that the economy at this point was based largely on tobacco plantations. You have other plantations in some of the other colonies and in Virginia as well, but tobacco was really the number one money generator. It was why people were moving there. But when we consider the evolution here of the southern colonies, and Virginia in particular, over the course of the 1600s and on into the 1700s, is you have to understand a little bit of the geographic spread of people. Who is where, what they're doing, when exactly they're there, and why, to get a good feel of sort of what these people were up to at this point in American history. Typically, what you're going to see ever increasingly as colonization spreads beyond this kind of bare, hold on by your fingernails kind of experience is one that gets a little bit bigger and a little bit deeper in terms of society. And what you've noticed here is that the wealthy farmers are going to be settling near the coastline or near the very large navigable rivers in Virginia's interior. And they are going to be the ones that are going to be employing huge numbers of workers on these plantations. And the idea behind a tobacco plantation is basically the same kind of model that you would see for a very large industrial factory today, whether it produces cars or toaster ovens or computer parts or whatever. And that is to crank out as much product as efficiently as possible for the purpose of selling it on the open market later. And so while a plantation, you might look at it and say, well, what's a farm? Well, yeah, it is, but it's a specific type that is going to be really, really large. It's going to employ a very large labor force. And the idea was you weren't going to eat the products of the land. You were going to put them on the market. You were going to sell them and make as much money as possible. Now, the labor involved, especially in the tobacco trade, is pretty grueling. Tobacco is something that is very labor intensive, and the fact that you have these sort of very narrow windows during which time certain tasks have to be accomplished with the tobacco in order to be able to get it to the market on time. Otherwise, the tobacco will go bad, or you can't sell it. And so, for example, when you pick it, the leaves mature from bottom to top, so you can't just go along and pick all the leaves at one time. You've got to get the bottom ones, which involve a lot of bending over, and then you got to come back and get the middle ones, and then you got to come back and get the top ones. And you have a very short frame of time that you can do that before the leaves are no good. And that's just one example. But a lot of the other activities that go along with cotton or with tobacco production, whether it be the sort of the packing or the smoking or all these other activities, you have to get it all done. So it's long hours, very laborious kind of conditions. And of course, this is 1600s colonial America, and so you get your sort of limited amount of medical care. And the really sad thing about a lot of this is these plantation owners are trying to maximize profits. And so one of the best ways to maximize profit is to limit the cost. And as a result of that, they're going to find a good way to cut corners on their labor costs by not providing a lot of food, clothing, shelter, medical supplies for their labor force. There's not a lot of care and concern in many cases for these people. And they're working out in the hot sun. I mean, there's already a limited amount of medical attention available anyway, no matter how much money that you have. And so it shouldn't surprise us that these, long, grueling, hot, kind of nasty working conditions in these sort of disease-ridden, Virginia low country locales are going to kill off a lot of these laborers. All right, and this is going to cause some serious questions for these plantation owners of, well, what are we going to do for meeting our labor needs? One of the earliest sort of questions about, well, who's going to do this work? How are we going to find a labor force large enough and cheap enough to be able to get this work done for us so that we can make a lot of money? Is going to be the indentured servant system. And so our earliest sort of system of quote-unquote slavery in the New World are in fact going to be white slaves from Europe going to be brought in under the indentured servant system. Now, this seems a little odd to us today that people would sort of volunteer for essentially service as a slave. But you've got to understand, again, a little bit of the background of these Europeans who are going to be taking this opportunity. You may have some people that are looking for religious or political sort of freedom, that they can't express themselves in Europe. Some of them are just bored of life in Europe. They want adventure, and so they're going to jump across the Atlantic in order to be able to do it, even if they have to be an indentured servant. But generally speaking, we think that most of the reasons behind this is economic stimulation, that these are poor Europeans that are going to jump at any chance that they have to own land. The contracts that these people would sign, while it would sign them over to basically a slave labor-like status for a period of 7 years, also then promised, usually, and it varied depending on the contract, 50 acres of land at the end of that term of service if you survived it. And this was an unheard of kind of opportunity for most of these poor Europeans who are still living in an essentially sort of feudalistic system. The only people who owned land, who actually owned it, had complete, total title access to land, for the most part in Europe, were the nobility. Poor people didn't own land. It's not like sort of today where the wealthy sort of billionaire, he has a 40-acre estate or 100,000 acre sort of plantation that he likes to go horseback riding on, and the poor people have a quarter acre that they got a little single wide trailer that they're living in. It's not like that. The only people who, generally speaking, who owned land, who actually owned it, were the nobility, were the wealthy, were the privileged elite. And if you were around at that point, you may have access to a lot of land, but you didn't own it. There were a few exceptions to that. You did have sort of free peasants that may have owned little plots of land here and there. But for the most part, these people did not have land, and land represented wealth. Land represented economic opportunity, because whatever you wanted to do with that land, start a farm, sell it, expand it, use it for timber, trade with the Indians, didn't matter what you were going to do with it. That was yours. That was your land, and you could make money off of it. You could live however you please. You didn't have to worry about, well, if I upset the Lord, he'll kick me out, because when you're a renter, that's the way that it goes. And so what they had to do was, of course, put up with some rather nasty conditions of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and then work basically as slaves for usually 7 years in the Virginia heat and the other sort of southern colonies as well, where you've got disease, you've got poor food conditions, limited amount sort of subsistence, clothing and shelter, and a lot of these people are going to die. A lot of them are not going to survive the 7-year tenure in order to get to the end of their term, but enough of them did. A sizable chunk of them managed to survive, and of course, they're ready at the end of the 7 years. All right, boss man, I did it. I'm ready to get my 50 acres of land. And they go to the guys, all right, I want my 50 acres. Where is it, right? Now, of course, they're looking around the plantation, which has been settled and cleared, and there's roads that lead to it, and there are perhaps docks down to the river or down to the quays for sale of their product into the international market for tobacco. They're not going to get 50 acres of the rich guy's land. That's not going to happen. These guys are going to take them out to the frontier. All right, 50 acres of this land. That's all yours. Okay, super. Forest primeval. Me and the squirrels and the wolves and alrighty, right? So while this may have been somewhat disconcerting to these guys, they are still pretty pleased. They've actually got 50 acres, or however much it was that they signed up for, of land. Land that's their own. They can live on it. They can do as they please. And so this is a significant upgrade for these people from their lives in Europe. Like we see here down at the bottom, usually these guys died. Most of them, overwhelmingly, are male, single, and young. This is going to be our draw pool for these indentured servants. And so that leads us to interesting questions. Male, single, and young. Where are we going to get the next generation of American colonists from? Because you're going to need to mix some females into the pot as well. And so you'll see here in the 1600s a pretty burgeoning mail order bride system. So I don't know that you necessarily get them from Russia or the Philippines or wherever it is you get them from now, but this is going to be one of the major sources of bringing women into the colonies, is the mail order bride. You can see down at the bottom a picture of one of these certificates of indenture for these servants. So if you survive, all right, if you survive this and you moved to the frontier, life was hard, but it was free. They're going to claim their land, they're going to clear it, they're going to girdle the trees, they're going to knock them down, they're going to burn them up, they're going to make log cabins, they're going to learn to make their own clothes, shoot straight, grow their own food, catch the local wildlife. Otherwise, they die. You either learned to be independent or you learned to be a corpse. And so this was life on the frontier here in 1600s America. It's hard for us to imagine sort of Middle Virginia being the frontier of America. The places that you could sort of drive on, Prince William Highway and things like that in the central parts of the southern colonies and things like that. But at one point, of course, that was the frontier area. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that clashes with the American Indians become pretty common for a lot of these people. As these settlements would get bigger and bigger over the course of several years, as more and more of the surviving indentures, as they head to the frontier to claim out stake out these claims, they're going to be clearing the forest. They're going to be pushing back a lot of the natural space that the Indians, of course, the Eastern Woodland Indians depended upon for their lifestyle. And so it's not going to take long for the Indians to kind of figure out that, hey, the more these white guys show up, the less of us have something to eat. And you're going to see, of course, the Indians, they're going to be coming up in a lot of these situations. You guys are moving into our territory. This is our land. This is our tribe's land. You guys need to get off of it. And of course, you flip it around and you look at it from the perspective of these settlers. And you say, wait a minute, I survived nasty ocean crossing. I survived 7 years of virtual slavery. I survived sort of making my little homestead out here in the middle of nowhere. And you say that this isn't mine? No, I don't think so. Okay? So you've got some serious irreconcilable differences. These clashes with the Indians, you can see in sort of the bottom picture down there. They had to fight a lot of these guys off, and the entire family, had to pitch in. Husbands, younger sort of kids, wives, the old people. They had to fire and reload, do medical treatment. Otherwise, they got wiped out. And it was not uncommon to come across some frontier homestead, and you find nothing but sort of bones in a looted house, where these people had tried to fight off the Indians and had failed. Now, economically, the idea was they looked at a lot of the planters, the plantation owners that had been in the generation before them of exploiting kind of the opportunities for tobacco plantations. Now, most of these guys are sort of in the wilderness frontier area, and they're not going to become the rich planters like they thought they might. They really hoped they were going to have sort of these huge operations. But as more and more people are hitting the tobacco market and more tobacco is hitting the market, that, of course, is going to adversely affect the price. And so these guys don't get super rich like they thought they might. And so this is typically what happens with a lot of new industries. The people that kind of get in first and take the big risk, they're the ones that are going to get the biggest payoffs sort of early on. While they don't become, generally, the super wealthy, they do become much more prosperous than they would have been had they stayed in Europe. Life is free, they're able to do things politically, economically, and socially that would have been impossible had they stayed in England. And so this is a big change for them in that way as well. Now, after a couple of generations of this taking place, all right, you're going to have an ever-increasingly social divide between these two sort of classes of Virginians. It become very, very evident as you look into who these guys were and what they were doing. And these two classes were these wealthy plantation owners that not only are separated in terms of social and economic status, but also, as we're going to see for the most part, geography. They were living near eastern parts of the Virginia colony, near the coastline. And then you've got the poor settlers who were kind of living free and easy, but they don't have a lot of money, and they are living on the frontier. So you've got a geographic divide between these sort of two groups. Well, as the poor settlers on the frontier grow in number, and as their colonial presence on the frontier continues to expand, they're pushing in on that space of the American Indian. And as a result of that, we're going to see the Indians are going to push back. And the Indian attacks in this area are going to cause pretty typical response amongst these frontier people. And that is, when it goes beyond just a few American Indians sort of attacking you, and it looks like it's actually sort of a large campaign, these people start banding together, and they do the same thing that you and I would do if you're sort of attacked, and that is you call for assistance. In this case, they're not going to sort of dial 911 and call for the police. They're going to go to the colonial government here in Jamestown, and they're going to ask the government to raise a militia to defend their homes. They say, hey, we need to put together a small army, hand out guns and ammunition, and go after the Indians. And so we will push them back so that way they won't attack us anymore. And this is not a new kind of thing in American history. And in fact, this would go on for like 2.5 more centuries in American history. So this is nothing sort of out of the norm, either before it or after it, in terms of the request of these frontiers people for assistance. However, the problem with this is who is going to be paying the taxes necessary to pay for the muskets and the ammunition and the medical supplies and the food and to get this all sort of come together? And that is, it's going to be the wealthy farmers. The wealthy plantation owners realize we can't tax the poor people because the poor people, they have no money. So we can't get money from them. So we're going to be the ones that are going to have to pay this tax, and yet they're looking around Jamestown. I don't see any Indian tax here. Well, of course not. They're not on the frontier. By this point, they're separated by a pretty healthy geographic distance from where the Indian attacks are taking place. And so why should we have to pay a lot of money when Indians aren't attacking us? And since for the most part, the wealthy farmers were the ones that had control of the colonial government, they're like, we're not going to vote to have a tax on us to defend you poor people. Okay, fine. Into this situation becomes a guy who has one of the yummiest names in all American history, and that's Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon, despite the fact that he was one of these wealthy plantation owners, he sided with the farmers against the wealthy plantation owners, and he basically said, listen, we're all kind of in this together. If the Indians attack them, we need to band together, and we need to do something about this. And he felt that they were really, the frontiers people, they were really being betrayed by the wealthy plantation owners in the eastern parts of the colony. And they, no, we're not going to do it. I don't care how tasty your name sounds, Francis Bacon. We're not going to pay the money. And so actually Bacon wound up leading a rebellion of the frontiers people against not the Indians, but against the wealthy plantation owners. Well, all of a sudden they're being attacked. Now we've got to pay money to have a militia put together to fight off Francis Bacon and his ragtag army of poor frontiers people. Well, long story short, Bacon and his super tasty sounding army, Bacon's Rebellion, is defeated. It turns out that while money can't buy you love, it can buy you a pretty powerful army in a lot of cases. And that's exactly what takes place here. The frontiers people are sort of sent back to the frontier after they're defeated. They're basically told, you're going to have to fend for yourselves, which is what they're going to do. And the effect, though, that this has on the plantation owners is going to be a pretty profound one. One, they're having trouble recruiting more indentured servants from Europe. Part of the problem that had been besetting Europe in previous generations was you had a recessed economy. Things were looking pretty bleak economically in Europe, and so hey, life of adventure and of a slave in America, that might not be too bad, get some land in the end. But as Europe's economy begins to pick up here, ever increasingly by the late 1600s, these guys are going to be looking at saying, well, we may have to get labor from someplace other than Europe. And after Bacon's Rebellion, a lot of these guys are saying, is it really a good idea to continue to send more and more frontiers guys out there that may potentially plot against us sort of every year? Maybe we need to come up with a different type of labor system. And so they're going to turn to another existing labor system, and that is black slavery from Africa. So they're going to look at this African slavery system that had already sort of morphed off of the continent of Africa to the islands and the coastal areas that were under the control of the Portuguese. So not too far away. And then with the Spanish colonies in the New World, they're going to sort of make that big hop across the Atlantic Ocean to slave markets in the Caribbean. And so if you were a southern plantation owner in North America, you didn't have to go very far in order to have access to one of the most bustling and affordable slave markets in the world, and that was the Spanish slave markets of the Caribbean, usually Cuba. So as the number of indentured servants waned, either because fewer people wanted to be indentured servants or because fewer of the plantation owners wanted to go the indentured servant route, they're going to turn ever increasingly to African slavery, right? And what we're going to see here is initially the African slaves that are brought into the American colonies operated basically along the same lines as the white indentured servants in the 1600s, to where they worked for a sort of set period of time. Once they were released, they were free, and they're free to engage in enterprise. For example, you can see some court documents of where a white slave owner and a black slave owner. They sort of sued each other over the use of the black slave, and actually the black guy won. So it was not exactly what you would expect here in colonial America, but ever increasingly what you're going to see is race and racism is going to become ever increasingly apparent, and you're going to see the introduction by the end of the 1600s of durante vita, which is for the life of the slave, that people are going to be enslaved and they are going to be slaves for life. Not only do you have a racial component to that, but you just have straight up economics, which is you go, you pay a certain price, you have this slave until the end of their working life, and you can exploit all of that labor rather than just a 7-year period or a 5-year period or 10-year period or whatever. With that, you can maximize return on the outlay. And so what you're going to see is now, by the late 1600s, and definitely by the time you get into the early 1700s, a large influx of slaves that originate in Africa into the southern colonies here in America. Now, when these people are coming in, one of the things that is happening, especially amongst this multinational white race, is assimilation. They're all sort of getting used to each other. English, even amongst the sort of Dutch settlers in New York, English is becoming the dominant language group. We're going to see that sort of a common culture is taking hold, even amongst sort of the wealthy planters and the poor frontiers people. You're seeing a lot of commonality in terms of culture due to assimilation. What we're going to see between white masters and black slaves is a lack of assimilation. There are going to be significant barriers to assimilation, and there's going to be a strong resistance, especially during the early colonial period. There's a strong resistance to assimilate black slaves into white culture. So that doesn't mean that these people aren't going to have a culture, that it just sort of stops. Actually, what you're going to see is that the mythology of sort of a singular West African culture is exposed, because what you have is actually a series of multi-ethnic West Africans. They all come from different languages, different cultural traditions. While they may have some base similarities, they're just as different in West Africa as you would see in, say, Western Europe. But because of the realities of slavery, they're all kind of thrown together, and they've got to make a day-to-day living for themselves. And so these multi-ethnic Africans, they begin to have to meld together, and what they do is they create a new culture, an African American culture, on these plantations of the American South. This introduction here of black slavery into the American South modified the Columbian Exchange that we detailed earlier. Now we have a much more specific and highly evolved trade route that we as historians generally refer to as the triangular trade. And so for those of you who stayed awake long enough in geometry class know that a triangle has 3 points and 3 sides. And so this is why we generally refer to this as the triangular trade, because there are going to be 3 major stopping points and 3 sort of legs on this route. So generally what you would see is it all is going to go in a clockwise, usually kind of motion for these. Trade would begin here in Europe, and we'll notice that it's going to be dominated early on by Spanish ships, and eventually they would be replaced by English merchant ships here in the triangular trade. The second point of call is going to be West Africa, and then the third would be the New World, usually the Caribbean, and then of course it would cycle back to Europe from there. So if you're going to pick a starting point here in Europe, typically what you would start off with is purchasing goods that are relatively inexpensive and easily produced in Europe, to trade to West Africans that they would want that they don't have themselves. Usually these are some kind of finished manufactured product, special metalworked types of items, guns, metal tools, things like that. And they are going to be taken from Europe to Africa, where they can then be traded at a profit. But typically what you're going to see is a lot of that profit is going to be absorbed into the main profit-making motive for the whole trip, and that is the purchase of slaves. Slaves had largely been rounded up by these West African kings. They were perfectly happy to sell off enemies of their nation or of their tribe, and they would be herded into what were referred to as these slave factories. It was basically a big warehouse for people. They would be put in there, and then as these slave ships would pull up, they'd say, okay, how many do we want? We want 100, we want 200, we want 300, however many the ship will hold, and then they would be brought out, and they would be put on board the ship. And so from Africa, they are then going to go to the next point, the Caribbean, and this sort of middle leg of this is often referred to as the Middle Passage. And so the slaves are going to be taken here to the slave markets of the New World, usually Cuba. Not always, but usually Cuba. It was somewhat unusual to bring slaves directly from Africa to the southern colonies directly. It was not unheard of, but generally speaking, the big slave markets were out of the Caribbean. And so the slaves were then sold over to slave traders in the Caribbean, usually so that they could buy the raw materials that were coming out of North America to take back to Europe. Lumber, food, molasses, pitch for making ships, hemp rope, things like that. So they would then take that back, the raw materials that are then going to be manufactured in manufactured goods. So you could then just keep running this cycle again and again. Now when we get to this point though of the Middle Passage, we get some pretty horrendous stuff. All right, when you look at this from the perspective of the people that survived this, it is pretty gut-wrenching kind of things going on. All right, so this Middle Passage, this leg of the triangular trade between Africa and the Caribbean, you're going to have over the course of this 10 million Africans forcibly shipped across the Atlantic. This is the largest forced migration in human history. Now, the overwhelming majority of this 10 million are going to be eventually sent to work in the sugar and other tobacco plantations of the Caribbean. And if you look at, for example, the ethnography of the Caribbean today, Haiti, Jamaica, parts of Cuba, places like that, and you look and say, oh, people descended from Africans. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Then when you look at the numbers, and you say, wait a minute, if it was 10 million in the 1700s, then how many 100 million should it be today? And the math doesn't work out, okay? And the reason for that is these people die. These people die in horrendous numbers as they're on these plantations. The overwhelming majority of them are male, and so there's no way, even if they weren't being worked to death, for them to propagate themselves into new generations on anything like a sustainable level. This is one of the major problems that Haiti had right from the beginning, is you've got such social destabilization, even after they managed to throw off French slavery, they're never really able to successfully make a stable society, and it's really kind of haunted them ever since. So while most of these guys are going to wind up in the Caribbean, some of these guys do wind up going to North and South America. Of course, in North America, they're going to wind up largely in the southern colonies, although you'd be able to find them almost anywhere in North America at this point. And then in South America, you'll see a lot of them are going to wind up in Brazil. You can still see sort of traces of African descent in some Brazilians today. Now, the actual transport is really, really awful stuff. These people are crammed into these ships as tightly packed as possible. They're going to be sort of chained down. They're going to be living in their own sort of vomit and excrement. They've got very little food in order to keep the cost of transporting them across the Atlantic down. Their job, the job of these people, is transportation, not fattening them up for sale and making them look good and things like that. That's not their job. So it's pretty horrendous kind of stuff. Here you can see that a lot of thought went into this kind of thing. A plan of a slave ship. How to pack as many people into as small a space as possible and get the job done. And so this is, we're going to put them here, put them there, in between decks, all these different places. And then eventually somebody has a bright idea. Instead of laying them on their backs, maybe we could lay them on their side so they don't take up quite as much room. And so this is the awful stuff that's taking place. All right. Now, when we look at the social evolution of the South, we're seeing slavery in the labor question, whether it's indentures or whether it's African slavery. They're driving a lot of the social transformations taking place there. When we look to, especially the New England colonies, we're seeing that ever increasingly it is the relationship of people to religion that is becoming more and more important, and it's being challenged in part due to changing economic stats. Right? A good example of this is the Salem witch trials. When you look at this, and so for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, for the sort of supernatural element of it, I don't want to take anything away from this. We're just going to try to discuss the bare facts of this without sort of invoking the supernatural, at least beyond the limits that we need to. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, right? This is going to take place here in Salem, Massachusetts, which is now actually Danvers, Massachusetts. in 1692. All right, there are a series of trials where this paranoia grips this growing Puritan community outside of Boston, and they start sort of charging each other with witchcraft. It starts with sort of a couple of well-to-do teenage girls that are accused of witchcraft, and they say, no, it was actually our sort of black housekeeper. She was the one that got us into it because she's like this voodoo priestess from the Caribbean. And then everybody starts charging everybody else. For the most part, it gets really, really out of hand. The civil colonial government has to come in because back in the 1600s, people took charges of witchcraft seriously. So you do have that kind of going on. And we still use the term witch hunt today in the context of people sort of losing their minds and kind of going after each other for silly reasons. Because we look at this and say, none of these people were actually witches. They couldn't turn anyone into a newt. They don't have supernatural power. This is kind of a silly thing. And these people, though, they took it very seriously. And we sort of overstate maybe how seriously they took it, all right? Because ever increasingly, when you look at who is it that's being accused and who is it that is doing the accusing, we see that there are actually some good little windows into some of the cracks in the social strata that this Puritan community is going through. Because by 1692, some of these people and their families had been occupying that part of North America for like 70 years. Most of these kids not quite as long. They had moved there. They had colonized the area a little bit later than the Mayflower in 1620. But some of these people had been there for a while. And their initial sort of zeal of we're going to move to the New World, we're going to do just what the Bible says, we're going to set up our society based along these really, really strict lines. This had come under a lot of strain. One, you got some geographic strain. As more people move in, they've got to move away from some of these communities. How do you go to church every Sunday when you're living in this kind of outlying frontier community that's maybe 20 miles away? So you're not going to church like you're supposed to. Oh, what does that mean? You know? So you've got these big, bad kind of questions with this. One of the other challenges to social authority is if you were poor, you were kind of supposed to be poor your whole life. That was your lot in life. You were supposed to enjoy that and work hard. But as we've seen, one of the truisms of life here in North America is economic opportunity. These Puritan guys, they tried socialism when they first got there. Right? We're all going to take a little allotment. Everybody was starving to death. They were going to die. And then they divided up the land, and they basically said, all right, everybody just work for yourselves, however much you make, you guys can keep. And then all of a sudden, everybody has got enough to eat, and then over the course of time, they follow that capitalistic approach, and then they're all making money. So, it shouldn't surprise us that 72 years later, some of these people who start off sort of poor, and then they work hard, and they save their money, and then, they're not poor anymore. Yeah, but the Bible, I thought the Bible said that you're, and this guy, this is complicated. And especially problematic were some of these women had economic opportunities, especially in some of the town and village areas, of operating their own businesses, whether they be sort of taverns or seamstress shops or things like that. And it shouldn't surprise us that the ones that are good at it, they make money too. Well, this challenges a lot of social order, not just the Puritan community, but a lot of communities at this point. They weren't really sure about all this. And while it might be sort of an overstatement to say that this is sort of, the rise of late 17th century feminism and it gets kind of smacked down by, misogynistic males in the period, and that might be a little bit of an overstatement, but you do see that the accusers, they were mainly farmers. These were the people that were kind of holding to the old traditions of, the church is supposed to run everything and we're going to stick to these rigid strictures, while ever increasingly the accused, the people that were having sort of the witchcraft finger pointed at them, they were mostly from the merchant class and they were overwhelmingly women. And so you get these very interesting scenes and these people are put on trial, have you signed a contract with the devil? And you get some of these people sort of flipping out and you get, a lot of these people get killed. They get hung. I think one guy gets like a whole bunch of rocks piled up on his chest. It's pretty nasty kind of stuff. So you did not want to get accused of being a witch at this point in American history. Now, maybe you get your own reality TV show. I don't know. So when you look at America here at the dawn of the 1700s, okay, and on into the 1700s, you got something really, really different in America than you have in a lot of places around the world. Now, you'll see a lot of diversity here in America, and you'll be able to find it in some other places that were like ports of call. And you've got a real international kind of community there. But they're not permanent. It's not a permanent kind of thing. You know, these people are kind of in and out, and you have to service, you know, an international kind of crowd. As you go into the hinterland of America, not just near the coast, but actually into the interior of America, you see a great deal of diversity here in American life. You've got diversity in terms of national origin, where you've got people of Dutch, English, African, Scottish, Irish, German descent. They're all occupying the same land space, and they're all sort of coming to terms with each other, learning a similar language, adopting similar religious practices. You didn't really see that anywhere else, to where you could go to Germany and say, well, you know, how many people of African descent do you have down here? We don't really have any of those kind of things. Or go to West Africa at that point, and hey, how many Irish colonists do we have here in West Africa? You don't really have that kind of thing. And so, mixed into all this, of course, you've got the indigenous American Indian population, which the only place that you can find those guys for the most part is in the Americas. So, nationalistically, if you were back in one of these home countries, you didn't really have to deal with anybody other than people of your nationality. If you dealt with them, it was a sort of foreign trade issue, or maybe you were at war with them. Here in America, you lived with them. They were your neighbors. They were your business partners. They were people that you traded with over long distances. They piloted the boat that you were, you know, using to get across the river. These were people that are all over the place. You're going to see a great deal of economic diversity. You've got rich planters, middle-class merchants, poor farmers, and then at the bottom of this, you've got slaves. And they're all kind of mashed in on top of each other. While I'm not going to try to kid you and say that, you know, the rich plantation owners spend a lot of time hanging out with sort of poor farmers and slaves, they did have to spend a lot of time together in towns and in villages in order to sort of make society happen, which wasn't really a whole lot of the case if you went to other places around the world. They were sort of occupying the same geography, but they didn't really interact with each other a whole lot. In America, you couldn't really afford to do that. You did have kind of, for example, high society, and you would look down on people like, you're going to marry that person? They're poor. But you had to talk to these people in town. You had to get involved with each other's lives because of the colonial experience. You're also going to see that in terms of religion, spirituality was very diverse as well. You've got Puritans, Anglicans, Catholics, Deists, Congregationalists. You've got, for example, also budding African Christians who are adopting Christianity with the zeal of converts. So you've got these changes as well. As we get here into the 1700s, we're going to talk about these two big movements intellectually that are going to really shape how the United States of America gets started and really fundamentally kind of still influence us today. Even though it may have happened, you know, over 250 years ago, they're become sort of interwoven with the American fabric to where you can't totally get them out of the way. We still react very strongly to these kinds of things today. And of course, they're both going to have strong influences here on eventually the American Revolution. Why it happens, but also kind of how it happens as well. The first of the two that I'm going to talk about is the Great Awakening. All right? The Great Awakening is the first American mass movement. So before Americans sort of stood in long lines to buy Beanie Babies and beat the stuffing out of each other, before they had these viral videos that they would sort of send each other on their phones, and everybody watched them and then made fun of them, even though they secretly liked them, you had the Great Awakening. And this was a religious revival, all right? Because by the time you get into the 1700s, one of the problems that you've got with America is a lot of these frontier places kind of evolve over time. If you go to a certain point when an area is first being settled, you're going to have very sparse settlements. You're going to have these people that are going to move out here into the middle of nowhere. They're going to kind of clear out things. They're going to set up their little log cabin. They got their family, and the next person may be 10 miles away. And then over the course of time, more people are going to move into the area, and you're going to have a few more of these little kind of frontier farms. And then eventually, you know, you may have enough people, you get together and kind of have a little village. And then as more and more farmers are in the area, you eventually will have enough to have kind of this crossroads town, and you'll have some services. And so you're going to see that a lot of these frontier areas, they are going to start out not like some of the colonial areas where we say, okay, we're going to build a church, and then we're going to build a town around it, and we're going to do our church, and then also we're going to do the other stuff that you've got to do to stay alive. We're going to farm, and we're going to have animals and stuff like that. So instead of that, you're going to see that it's not uncommon for some of these places to sort of evolve unchurched. Because you may have people coming in and say, well, I'm Lutheran. Well, no, we're Irish Catholic. And say, no. Well, we're this religion or we're that religion. And while they may agree on Christianity, there really wasn't necessarily kind of one church that was going to fit all of them. And so some of these places were either underchurched or in some cases, unchurched at all, because they didn't have the opportunity to do that in the beginning. Now, you're also going to see that the religious revival, some of these preachers here are going to have some serious theological disagreements with what was going on in terms of Christianity at this point. Some of the Calvinistic religions were coming under a lot of fire at this point, and they were often referred to as the old light churches. They represent sort of old theology, the Puritans and some of this kind of stuff. This was hundreds of years ago. Why are we still doing this kind of stuff? We need to get rid of all that. We need to replace it with much more modern kind of theology. And so these were referred to as the New Light churches and New Light theology. Now, what you typically had was you would go and you'd see these traveling ministers, and they would show up, they would get on these stumps, and they would deliver very different messages than what a lot of people had heard. And so if you've heard the term sort of hellfire sermon, it comes from the Great Awakening. And these guys could come in and they would excoriate these people, and they would say, hey, you guys need to get right with God or you're going to burn in hell forever. God is going to damn you to the pits of eternity, and you're going to burn and snap, crackle, pop. You're going to be on God's barbecue pit forever. And so, whoa, what is this? Normally you go to church and it's like, God loves you, and you need to not do the things that are wrong, and then you sing a couple of, really ancient hymns, and you go home. Right? This guy, on the other hand, he's really laying it down. He's saying it's you, and you got to stop drinking, and you got to stop cheating on your wife. And this was uncomfortable kind of stuff. Nobody had heard this kind of emotional kind of thing before, and so they would have to go to these tent revivals. In some cases, they didn't have sort of buildings big enough for these guys. And of course, if there was a church in the area, no pastor's going to rent his church out to this crazy hellfire preaching weirdo. And so they would go out, they had these big tent revivals, and they'd meet outside to accommodate these huge crowds of people. They get all whipped up and get all emotional. Those of you who've ever been to a rock concert, and you spend a lot of time, sort of take your shirt off or whatever, go, woo! And you realize, I would never do that if it wasn't for 10,000 other screaming idiots. Well, you see the same kind of group dynamic here. You get this very emotional preacher, and you get these people that are praying, and they sort of flip out. So on the one hand, you got this, which is sort of entertaining, for us as students to kind of look at. People are, you're going to burn in hell forever. Ah! People crying and rolling around on the ground. That's sort of fun to study. But when we look at this intellectually here, this is going to have some strong strains of fundamental Americanism. And that is the idea that it is the individual that needs to come to terms with God, and a real stress on the idea that you need to read the Bible for themselves. Don't take my word for it. Read the Bible for yourself. See what it says in there. And so these strong messages of individualism and the idea that you need to read things for yourself, they become part and parcel with the Great Awakening movement, but they never get totally washed out, even as the Great Awakening sort of abates a little bit later. Now, the founder and most famous minister of this movement was Jonathan Edwards. And a good example of this, for those of you who didn't have the Great Awakening or Jonathan Edwards sort of read to you when you were in high school or someplace else, his most famous of these hellfire sermons that he delivered to his congregation was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So right away from the title, you get a good idea of what's going on. And here's a quote from it, right? The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. That's some pretty scary stuff. Okay? So you can see how this would make a strong response to people in groups. But more importantly, the idea behind this was it was you as an individual, that need to do something about this. All right? Now, the other side of the coin, part two of the movement here, that takes place in the 1700s, is the Enlightenment. Now, just like you'll see the Great Awakening, this was not a movement that started in America, but it actually started in Europe and then gets transported to America. All All right, so the Enlightenment, for those of you who don't know, and if you would like to find out, you can take my World History 2 class. We talk about it there. This is an intellectual movement that begins in Europe, of these people that are sort of studying the world, and they're ever increasingly sort of asking questions. They're trying to use human reason to discover things, and some of them would be what you and I might refer to as kind of science, natural history, biology, soil chemistry. Some of it would be social sciences, linguistics, demography, things like that, geography, cartography, astronomy. All these guys are sort of varied field of interest, but all of them at some point are going to turn to social issues, whether they be political ones or people in their day-to-day lives. The idea was behind this, reason and humanity can fix all of society's ills. And it should surprise us that these American colonists, who still have strong ties to Europe, they have a lot of commerce that goes back and forth. In fact, a lot of people would go back and forth between Europe and between North America at this point. They are going to get woven right into this European intellectual movement. It spreads very, very quickly in the colonies among the educated. And so when you take down the list, for example, of American Enlightenment figures, it's a pretty revealing list. You get guys like Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams. Those guys all sound pretty familiar. Yeah, okay, that's not a coincidence that you look at these guys and you say, wait a minute, weren't they like all the revolutionaries that helped found the United States? They led the revolution? Yeah, they were. It's not a coincidence that they were also heavy into the Enlightenment. And once we get to the Declaration of Independence, for example, when you look at it, and we'll take a moment to sort of break down the major parts of it and say, hey, these guys were all Enlightenment thinkers, and they basically just copied a lot of the Enlightenment documents kind of floating around the day. Sort of like when you guys go on the internet and sort of copy stuff and paste it in and say, hey, this is what's going around. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing, okay? But when you look at the conclusions that these Enlightenment figures reached, human reason, the ability of your mind to sort of understand the universe around it and to make change, it stresses the idea that the individual is paramount, okay? The individual is paramount, and it has to be protected, it has to be advanced. Therefore, education is a great key to all this, because you've got to educate yourself in order to be able to understand the world around you, in order to be able to affect these changes, so that way you can use your reason to its fullest. Now, actually, the greatest Enlightenment figure of the period from America was Benjamin Franklin. He was the one that probably, if you were in London, or if you were in Paris, or if you're in some of these sort of hotbeds of the Enlightenment at this point, and say, hey, which one of the American guys do you think is the sort of most important intellectual figure? Probably the answer you would have gotten was Benjamin Franklin. Okay, there were a lot of other ones that you would have gotten as well, but Franklin was probably the most widely recognized. And really, he's kind of the biggest one. He's kind of the Babe Ruth of the Enlightenment for America as well. He was a great inventor. He and his father, helped prove that electricity was like a real thing, and not just sort of the static stuff you kind of popped at each other when you shuffle your feet on the floor in the middle of winter. He invented bifocals. He invented the first home heating system. The post office later on would be his idea. Hey, we gotta have some system where we just deliver mail to each other. Hey, there you go. All right. Not only was he an inventor, though, but he was also a statesman. He was very interested in government and in politics, how society sort of shaped itself. And so it shouldn't surprise you that most of our ideas about government, how it's supposed to work, come from the Enlightenment. So when you look at the two sort of movements, it looks like they're kind of opposites from each other. That, well, the Great Awakening is sort of spiritual and it's related to God, and well, the Enlightenment, well, that's science and reason, and they fight each other. They don't have anything in common. There's a certain amount of truth to that. However, there also are some areas of commonality. So I made this little Venn diagram to give you this idea of what is unique to the Great Awakening and what is unique to the Enlightenment, but also what is this area where they overlap. All right. So the Great Awakening tried to wake up the American Christian movement, and it would be very, very successful at doing that. People that had kind of abandoned religion or had never really gotten on board with it. Churches sort of sprang up all over the place, and so this was very successful. It also tries to spread Christianity to the frontiers, It provided these itinerant preachers to go and provide services for people that maybe were kind of too remote to have regular religious services, and so that was something that changed as well. You're also going to see that new denominations are going to begin, so you've got some theological advancements that take place with the Great Awakening as well. Now the Enlightenment stressed science, stressed reason, but also democracy. But when you look at this slice that is shared by both of these guys, both of them push for education and literacy. The Enlightenment pushed for those so that you could use your reason, you could understand the world to its fullest extent. You know, if you want to read the classical documents, well, you need to learn how to read Greek and Latin. You know, you need to be able to read the scientific papers, so that way you need to be educated. If you're involved in the Great Awakening, you needed to be educated and literate, so that way you could read the Bible for yourself, and it would make sense. So you could investigate God through the Bible in that way. Both of them stress the importance of the individual. In the Great Awakening, it wasn't your group that was going to hell, it was you. You need to make a good relationship with God. And the same with the Enlightenment. It didn't matter what all the group was doing. If one person's rights and liberties are being abridged, if they're being oppressed, then everybody is affected by that as well, because essentially no one's rights and liberties are being preserved. Now, when we go through much of the 1600s politically, one of the major features that you'll notice here of the relationship between England and her colonies in North America is this situation that we often refer to as salutary neglect. Right? One of the problems that these colonists ran into right away, as soon as they get to North America, is, all right, who's in charge? And they have some basic kind of ideas about, well, if you're with this company, these corporate people, they're kind of in charge, or you're with this church, well, the church is kind of in charge. But who's the government, right? Who's the overall government over this? And if you've got an issue and you need to go to the government, if you're back in England, for example, the head of the government is the king, right? And so you petition to the king to have the militia come and defend you from attacking marauders. Okay. Well, the king, he may be in London or maybe in Windsor Castle or I don't know, wherever kings hang out, right? And so you may not be able to get him. So, well, you got, local lords, right? You got local nobility that you can go to this guy who's a lot closer and say, hey, we get this problem, blocked up roads or storm damage or marauders or whatever the problem is. When you look at this, though, the issue with that is you come to America and say, okay, who's the government? Nobody. Nobody is the government here. The king, he's over us. We're all English citizens. This was, for the most part, true. The Dutch, they get taken over by the English. And so these other nationals, it's Germans, it's Irish, and some other people, they move in. They're still nominally under the English king. Okay, well, the king. Well, he's in England. Well, we use the local nobility. There is no local nobility, right? There's no Duke of Boston to go to. Okay, you can't go and ask these people of any locale, well, what do we do? How are we going to organize things? And so, right away they figure out this, that there is no local nobility. Nobody is really born any better than anybody else. And for the most part, these guys are all taken from the non-noble classes of Europe, which means they're all equal. England's too far away to rely on any kind of immediate response, right? Because it's not like the Indians sort of coming in and they have bows and arrows and they're shooting. Like, wait, we got to call England for help, and it's going to be 6 weeks there and 6 weeks back. So if you give them sort of 6 weeks, 18, 20 weeks, give or take. Can you guys not attack us right now? This is not a practicable solution. Okay, so they need a government right away to deal with local matters. And they don't have one, and they're all sort of equal. And you're going to see that basically the colonists go to democracy right away. The Mayflower Compact is, in some ways, regarded as kind of the first constitution. These guys sit down and go, who's in charge? I guess we all are, right? They detail out how the colony is going to operate and who's going to do what, and then they all sign it, like it's a contract. And you're going to see the same thing from a lot of the other colonies throughout New England, the middle colonies, all the way into the south. And eventually what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, well, if we're all equal, what we'll do is we'll go to a Republican form of government where you elect some kind of legislative body in order to handle the administration of the local government. And these guys are going to be able to do the things that governments do. They raise taxes, they decide local matters, they pass ordinances and laws, they detail money for the militia, they pass ordinances on where roads are going to cross rivers, how bridges are going to be constructed. I don't know when garbage pickup day is, whatever it is that they've got to figure out here in colonial America, right? Now, England didn't totally just abandon these guys. Okay, you guys figure it out. As long as the cash is rolling in, we don't care. They did appoint governors for the colonies. They would send these guys over and they said, okay, you guys are going to oversee these guys, make sure they don't sort of run wild. But for the most part, these guys were actually at the mercy of the local colonial legislature, because in order to save money, the crown in England said, okay, the governor is here to sort of keep a firm hand on you guys. He's here for you. So you've got to pay him. Which normally you would think the colonies would be kind of ticked at. Like, man, you're going to send this guy to boss us around, and we've got to pay his salary? So on the one hand, the crown's like, yeah, we're able to defray some costs. We put off the guy's salary to the colonists, so we don't have to pay it ourselves. But in reality, this was a great tool. This was a great tool for the colonial legislature. And these guys would get off the boat, these governors, they would get off the boat from England. And they're probably like a lot of politicians, most of them, I got great ideas, this is what we're going to do, and you guys are going to march to my beat. And of course, it doesn't take long for these local colonial legislatures to sort of put some firm hands on their shoulder and say, listen, blah, that's not how it's going to work here, okay? We're the ones that run the show here on this side of the Atlantic. You just sort of wave when we tell you to. You do what we say, and we'll pay you. If not, not. So we can either have a really good relationship, and you can hang out and get to be the governor and make sort of minor decisions here and there and leave most of it to us, or we can do it the hard way. And for the most part, these colonial governors decided to do it the easy way. It wasn't always true. You had your sort of Dominion of New England moments. But for the most part, they kind of took the path of least resistance. And so they kind of allowed the colonial legislatures to do whatever it is that they wanted to do. If not, they got sort of dealt with. Like I said, the Dominion of New England got broken up pretty forcefully by the colonists. When the crown tried to redo a lot of the charters here in the New England colonies. You also see, for example, the governor of North Carolina. No, I'm going to do things my way. You guys aren't going to do my kind of thing. And they almost never paid his salary. Oh, sorry, governor, there wasn't enough money in the budget this year to pay you. I just really don't know what to tell you. We're really, really sorry about that. So this was a pretty powerful tool. Now, when you look at, though, through much of the 1600s, England is actually pretty busy with doing other stuff in the late 17th and the early 18th centuries to really give a lot of attention to the colonies. For example, in 1648, you're going to see the beginning of the English Civil War, where an English king, Charles, is going to get his head cut off. And that, of course, sparks this massive fighting that takes place between the guys that are on the sides of the king, or what used to be the king, the new king, and then, of course, the side of Parliament, and then eventually you get a dictator with Oliver Cromwell, and you get people that are sort of opposed to that, and so then you get this massive campaign where they go and they beat the stuffing out of the Irish, and so England is kind of busy with England stuff for quite some time, and they don't have a lot of time to really keep their eye on the ball with the colonies. And they leave this mostly up to corporate activity, that these companies that had invested in a lot of these colonial businesses, they're bringing in goods to England, and so the money and the cash is still flowing. And so really, the policy of kind of England was, hey, if you guys are still cranking out cash, for the most part, we're going to be happy to let you do that. So what happens here is Americans develop not only a taste for a representative democratic government, but a long, long time that they have to practice it. So in 1776, when Americans vote to separate themselves from England and establish their own sort of independent democratic republic, it wasn't this brand new idea. They already had functioning democratic republics, many of which had been operating for 150 years. All they had to do was change the sort of, England and scratch through that and replace it with the United States of America. So this was something that they had gotten pretty good at, and not only that, but they ever increasingly wanted to continue to do this. So we got a couple of examples to use as case studies. All right, the first of these is the House of Burgesses. All right, this is the first American legislature. It is elected in the Virginia colony. Now, before we get sort of head over our heels, sort of swooning at American history, oh, we're so brilliant, we think of these things, we just come up with these awesome ideas. We wouldn't agree with necessarily all of kind of the put together for how this worked itself out. Yes, it was a representative democratic republic. They did sort of vote delegates into this legislature, where then the representatives would vote on the matters of the day. But this wasn't quite what you and I would expect in terms of the electorate. For example, only property-owning males could vote. The idea behind that was if you didn't own property, you don't have a stake in the government anyway. So you don't get to vote. Sorry. So this did sort of trend the government towards catering to the wealthy, as we saw with Bacon's Rebellion, right? But once these guys got together, they did a lot of what sort of our legislative bodies do today in America. They decided matters for the entire colony. So what would eventually become states, they would come up with the colonial sort of tax policy, the legislative enactions of the criminal code, how people sue each other for money, all those kinds of things that you have to do. They were set up court systems, but they didn't understand that most of these colonies were sort of too big to govern from one central location with any amount of detail. So they did, again, what for the most part we do today, which is you divide it up into smaller subsections. Most states today, they have the counties, and this is exactly what Virginia had. The House of Burgesses broke Virginia up into a series of counties, and the county matters were handled by county elected bodies. So you may not be at the colonial legislature in Jamestown at the House of Burgesses, but maybe you were at the county level. You were sort of deciding, when trash pickup day is, whatever it is that you're doing here in colonial America. Now, the counterpose to that, a little different than what you would see in the New England colonies. The New England colonies had what they referred to as the town meetings, all right? In many cases, they were weekly, or in a lot of cases monthly, depending on how often you needed to sort of meet together. And generally speaking, you had what we refer to as direct democracy. So for those of you who studied sort of ancient Greek history, and again, for those of you who haven't, World History 1, which I offer. The Athenians used direct democracy. Basically, okay, we got this proposition, to spend more tax money on X. Everybody gets in the room. Okay, we have a quorum of people. Okay, yeah. All right, let's all vote in favor. Aye. In favor? Nay. Okay. So this is what they would do. And so these New England town meetings, they basically all sort of pack it in there, and they say, okay, we need to reroute, the streets because of, garbage backup, or, the storm, blew out one of the bridges, or whatever it is. And they just are all going to vote on it. So a direct democratic process. But what we're seeing here throughout this period of salutary neglect is Americans, they're getting a lot of practice at doing this. And so for those of you turn on TV and you watch these sort of politicians scream at each other, not really a new thing. In fact, it goes further back even than the Continental Congress of the 1770s. It goes all the way back here into the 1600s with most of these colonial legislatures.